much and good afternoon. This afternoon we're going to be talking about communication skills. We're going to be looking at improving our communication skills. We're going to be looking at communication in business, in your personal life. We're going to be looking at written communication, at verbal communication. We're going to be looking at a full range of skills that will help you communicate better. The skills that we're going to be looking at apply, doesn't matter what you're doing. And we all communicate. We all communicate every day. And the real issue in business is it's not what you know that matters. It's how you communicate what you know that really matters. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. How to improve your communication skills. We've got a number of rules to look at. But before we get into any of that, I'm going to tell you a small story. Some years ago, the lady who does our cooking and cleaning came to me and she said, can you help me? She said, I want to try and work at the weekends. She works for us during the week, Monday through to Friday. She said, I want to get work at the weekends. Can you help with some advertising to get work at the weekend? So I said, sure, I'll give you a hand. So she and I sat down together and we produced an advert that she was going to put out in the local shops. And the advert said this: excellent maid available, good with kids, trustworthy, can cook, hard-working, available now. For more details, etc., etc., etc. Now, please don't all rush at once. She has work, okay? But what was interesting, she took this advert and she put it into a number of local shops. And within one day, we'd had 15 replies, which was pretty good. Unfortunately, 14 of those were from maids looking for work, and only one of them was from a maid from an employer who was looking for a maid. Now, I was sharing this with my wife at dinner. We always, dinner's a very important time for us, and we go through the stuff that happened during the day. And I was sharing this with my wife, and she said, oh, they're so stupid, aren't they? Can't they read? You know? And I was agreeing with her, of course, because she's my wife, you know. Until I realized that we were both breaking rule number one of communication. Rule number one, and the most important rule in communication, is this: the responsibility for the success of any communication rests with the communicator. And in that case, that was me. The responsibility for the success rests with the communicator. So if the communication has broken down, it's my fault, nobody else's fault. If communication's not working, it's the responsibility of the communicator to make sure it's working. Now, this is an interesting rule because so often we break this rule. And it's too easy to break. I remember I was sitting with a friend of mine in his office. We were having a chat and a cup of coffee, and one of his team came in waving a piece of paper. And the guy said to his boss, my friend, he said, boss, I've got this memo from you, but I don't understand what it means. Can you explain to me what you mean in this memo? So my friend looked at him rather angrily, and he said, what do you mean you don't understand what it means? It's in English, isn't it? And he said, yes. He said, and you understand and read English, do you? And he said, yes. He said, well, you go away and you read it again, then you come back and you tell me what you think it means. I thought that was a bit harsh, personally, and I said so. And, you know, he was breaking rule number one of communication. The responsibility for the success rests with the communicator. If my friend's subordinate couldn't understand the memo, it was my friend's fault, not the subordinate's fault. Now, this, of course, raises some interesting challenges here in South Africa, because we've got 11 official languages, and we so often communicate in the language that we're comfortable with. But in actual fact, we should consider perhaps communicating in the language that the people who are receiving the communication are more comfortable with, because that is our responsibility to do. The responsibility for the success of any communication rests with us, the communicator. Sometimes we expect people to read our minds. Sometimes in communication we think that we need to be mind readers, and we do sometimes. I remember not so long ago my wife and the family were sitting in the lounge, and my wife said to my little daughter, she's young, the youngster in the family, and she's at that lovely age where she still wants to do things. You know that age. It doesn't last long, does it? But she's still keen to do things. So my wife said to my daughter, "Darling, won't you go into the room and get my glasses? They're on the table." So my daughter says, "Sure," jumps up from where she's sitting, rushes to the lounge door, and then skids to a halt like a cartoon character on the wood floor there at the lounge door, because she has no idea where to go. Because she was asked to get the glasses from the table on the room. Now, which glasses, which table, which room? I mean, who on earth would know? You see, we so often expect people to read our minds when we try and communicate. We do this at work too. We think, or we expect people to pick up, to read between the lines, but we shouldn't expect that. We are responsible. The responsibility for the success of the communication rests with the communicator. That's us. So rule number one, the responsibility for the success rests with the communicator, which leads very quickly into rule number two. Rule number two says that the focus of any communication should be on the audience. Now, I've used the word audience here, and by audience I mean anybody who's receiving the communication. It could be a group like we have here, but it could be an individual who you're talking to. It could be somebody who's reading your book or your memorandum or your report. It's the person or people receiving the communication. And the focus of the communication must be on the audience. Now, this is very important too, and so often we break it. Let me give an example. I want you to imagine that you want a salary increase. Look, I know you're all paid far too much more money. You can't imagine wanting any more, but just work with me here, okay? Just imagine you want a salary increase. So you go to your boss, and I'm going to give you 4 things that you will use that will help you get a salary increase. You've got to choose one. The first one, I deserve more money because my wife's just had a new baby. Okay, remember that one. Or number 2, I deserve more money because I'm a really nice guy. It's my favorite. I think that's my favorite. Number 3, I deserve more money because rehiring and training a replacement is more expensive than a reasonable increase. Or number 4, I deserve more money because I have performed well this year. Okay, who thinks number 1's most likely to get a salary increase? Look, what about number 2? Who thinks number 2? You're a tough lot here, aren't you? What about number 3? Who thinks number 3's most likely to get a salary increase? Nobody? One hand goes up there. What about number 4? Who thinks number 4? Show of hands. Everybody. Okay, pretty much everybody else. All right. There's only one there that looks at rule number 2, or is using rule number 2, and that is number 3, not number 4. Now, of course, you're thinking number 4 because you're thinking as a subordinate. But you're already paid to perform well this year. That's what you're paid for already. The way in which your boss is most likely to be thinking, and those of you who are bosses in this room will know this, the way in which your boss is most likely to be thinking is that rehiring and training a replacement is more expensive than a reasonable increase, so maybe I should give him $1 or $2. That's the way bosses think. Now, you may not want to rephrase your request in that way, but you would certainly want to focus on the needs of the audience, what people care about. So often in communication, we make the mistake on focusing on what we care about when we're trying to get an idea across, instead of focusing on what the audience cares about. It's very important. You need to focus on what people you're presenting or speaking or writing for care about. Now, there are some easy examples of this. For instance, if you are writing a children's book, you would plainly write about things that the children can relate to. If not, then plainly you wouldn't get that message across to the child. It's exactly the same if you're writing an article for a magazine. If you're writing for the You magazine, for instance, you would write in a different way than if you were writing for The Economist, for instance. You have a different audience and you would communicate in a different way. Because you know that the people who are writing those magazines know they have to focus on what the audience cares about. And they're different, of course. Different groups of people think about different things. Give you another example. I was listening to a speech by Bill Clinton some years ago when he was running America there. Now, I'm not a great Bill Clinton fan, I didn't think America could do any worse than Bill Clinton until George Bush took over. Another story altogether. In any event, I'm not a great Clinton fan, but he is a great orator. He's a very good speaker and making most of his money nowadays speaking, doing the speaking circuit. He's a great speaker. And I was listening to him talking about I was listening on the radio, he was talking about some war or other that America was involved in. There were so many that he was involved in, I forget which one. But during that speech, he was talking about some war. And I was only half listening on the radio, half listening to what he had to say. Then he said this. He said, I have to do these things for the sake of the world's children. And I started to listen to that. Hell, I've got 5 children. I can relate to the world's children. So I started to listen. And I listened right the way through to the end of the speech. And you see, he grabbed my attention. In fact, he was saying nothing about the world's children. And he was just talking about his efforts to conquer some island or other. But by saying, I have to do these things for the sake of the world's children, he grabbed my attention. And that's what he was trying to do. It was just a technique to grab my attention by focusing on the needs of the audience. And of course, as the President of America talking on the radio, he's talking to pretty much the world. And there are very few things that everybody in the world care about, but one of them is children. So by weaving that into his speech, he was able to grab the attention of me in that case, and then be able to continue on with whatever he wanted to say, having got my attention. We can learn from that. When you are writing or when you are speaking to communicate to a group, focus on what they care about. Weave into whatever you're saying something that they care about to grab their attention. Then when you've got their attention, then you can talk about the real issues that you want to talk about. So, rule number 2, focus on the needs of the audience. Understand your audience, and then focus very clearly on what they care about. Rule number 3, good communication, and this is all. Good communication has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Most communication that I get to see, be it reports or letters or whatever, they tend to just have a middle section. They leave out the beginning and the end, but the beginning and the end are probably the most important parts of that communication, whatever that might be. Let me give you some examples. Good communication has a beginning. At the beginning, you want to do 2 things really. You've got to grab the attention of the people you're communicating to and introduce the subject matter in some way. Now, lots of different disciplines have lots of different ways of doing this, different communication styles. For instance, a newspaper would call it a headline. A headline grabs your attention and tells you a little bit about the article. Now, I don't know if you consider this, but headline writing is a skill all on its own. In newspapers, the person who writes the headline may not be the person who writes the story. It's a different skill. And so they use different skills in order to write headlines. The reason for that is very simple. When we are reading a newspaper, we don't simply read everything. We just read the headlines first. And if the headline grabs our attention, then we will read on. But if the headline doesn't grab our attention, we're not going to read it. So, in newspapers, they use this headline to grab their attention. This particular headline, insurance rep jumps 50 meters into a river and survives, grabbed my attention. Well, I thought the world could do with one less insurance rep. But in actual fact, the article was rubbish, but the headline grabbed my attention. And that's what it was for, to grab your attention. Then there's a hook. Salespeople call it a hook. I don't know if you've ever seen this one before. Earn 5,000 Rand a month in your spare time. Ever seen that before? Yeah, it pops up, doesn't it, from time to time. I use that because it's very interesting. It's the oldest known advert. You would have found exactly the same advertising, or very similar, on the streets of Rome 2,000 years ago. And it's still working now, and probably in 2,000 years it'll still be there somewhere on lampposts, although we probably won't have lampposts in those days. It grabs your attention, you see. Makes you lean forward, wants to read or to hear more. Authors will call it a book title. A book title grabs your attention. This is an interesting title. How to Win Friends and Influence People. Interesting title. How many people have heard of that book title? By show of hand, how many people have heard of that? Whoa, half the audience. Okay, that's interesting. Anybody know when that book was published? First published? 33. It's a Dale Carnegie book written in 1933. And yet half of this audience have heard of this book. I hope that my books, half of any audience will have heard it, will remember my books in 70 years' time. But I doubt it somehow. Why has this book lasted so long? Look, it's not a bad book, I must tell you. But the real reason why it's still in your bookshops right now, if you go and have a look, it's still on the shelves there. The real reason is because the title is just brilliant. How to Win Friends and Influence People. Who on earth does not want to win friends and influence people? Everybody does. So the title is brilliant. Grabs your attention, you see. Speakers use this beginning section as an introduction. This particular introduction here, do you want to be rich, it says. This afternoon we're going to talk about 10 ways to win at the casino. I missed this one, unfortunately. Which is why I'm still here talking to you, I guess. But it's a good title. It grabs your attention, makes you lean forward. Yes, you'd like to hear more. So the beginning of any communication is designed to grab your attention. The next stage is the middle section. And in the middle section, we have to incorporate all of the key issues that you want to raise in your communication. Now this might be quite short, there may only be one or two, there may be more, I don't know, it depends upon what you're communicating for. But in this middle section you want to raise a number of issues. Now, what is interesting about all communication is your attention span in any communication is not exactly the same throughout that communication. At the beginning of any communication you will tend to be very attentive, but that will drift away and then pick up towards the end of that communication. So if you look at that graph and keep that in your mind, and then think of whatever you want to communicate, the key issues you want to communicate want to be raised when the people you're communicating to are most attentive. So if you hang on to that graph, then if you look at the key issues you'd want to raise, number one, your most important point will probably be raised right at the beginning of what you want to say. But your second most important point you should raise at the end of that middle section, because that's when people are second most attentive. Not only that, it leads you into the end part of your communication. The end is where you will summarize what you've just said, and then ask for some commitment. So you will summarize in the end and ask for some commitment. Beginning, middle, and end. All communication has a beginning, a middle, and an end. If you're writing letters, if you're writing a report, if you are speaking to a group, beginning, middle, and end. Design your communication around that. Letter writing, of course, is just the same. We need the same things. In letter writing, when you're writing a letter, when I was very young, I was taught an acronym, which, very young in business, I was taught an acronym which has proved very useful for me throughout my career. And the acronym